Hello, and welcome to Pixel Chatter, the show where we bring you stories, insights, and conversations with the leaders shaping the Pro AV industry. I'm your Pixel Pro, Justin Lachovsky, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today as we dive into another episode exploring the people and innovations driving the world of Pro AV and digital signage. Today, we're talking about something a little bit different, but incredibly impactful: the power of podcasts in connecting and educating the Pro AV community. And who better to join us than Tim Baker? Tim has been with Signage Live for over a decade, working to drive innovation in digital signage while helping businesses worldwide create impactful experiences. Through his podcast, Digital Signage Explored, Tim has connected listeners with some of the brightest minds in Pro AV, giving a platform to ideas and voices that are shaping our industry's future. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's, start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your journey into digital signage and Pro AV, and what brought you over to Signage Live.
Yeah, well, I mean, the journey is pretty start-stop because Signage Live was my first entrance into anything AV. Before that, I sold chocolate. So there really wasn't a lot of history before that, but I've had quite a long tenure within Signage Live. I've had the fortune of kind of moving around the roles within the business. So starting off in sales, moved into technical pre-sales for a little while, and then kind of progressed over to marketing. So by the time I got to this stage, I had a little taste of everything in terms of dealing with distribution and resellers and customers, and then also working from a technical perspective with IT teams. So I'd seen everything from different angles at point.
Right on. So it sounds like you found your sweet spot over on the marketing side. Maybe you can tell us a bit about what sort of inspired you to start your own podcast.
It's definitely, I mean, it was a joint conversation between me and our CEO, Jason Cremens at Signage Live. And he's always really ahead of the curve when it comes to, technology and what's coming down the line. So we sat and we started looking at what other industries were doing, and it just made a lot of sense. I think obviously there's still some well-established shows in and around the industry, but there wasn't one that was specifically there to highlight kind of key features or focus on end user solutions. And that's what we want. That's kind of the gap we wanted to fill.
Yeah, that's great. I think, obviously a lot of these shows, anything that we can do to help, continue the education in the community, which I think is just, something that has been lacking over the years. But I'd say in the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot more information sharing coming up. And I think, podcasts are that perfect avenue for it. So how do you feel that the, Digital Signage Explored is, help connect listeners with other faces and voices in the industry?
It's been a really interesting one. Is that the beginning of the inception of it was definitely originally more end user focused, but I do think that's kind of changed over time, just because the industry in itself is it's inherent in comparison to others. It's much smaller. So there are a lot of voices out there that maybe don't get their airtime, and it's really good to give them an opportunity to talk about the solutions they're providing or what they've done with specific customers. And it's just a much more inclusive platform to be able to go and talk to people. You can write blog posts all day or LinkedIn pictures or LinkedIn text, whatever it might be. But there's something about video to video, like we're doing now, it's a lot more human. And I think people crave that interaction before they start, business dealings with people. Understanding the person behind, the contract or whatever it is really valuable.
I couldn't agree with you more. One of the things that I used to do when I started in, digital signage and Pro AV was I'd go through white paper after white paper and blog after blog. But, after time, you kind of just get exhausted by this, and it's, information overload.
Mm.
Whereas I feel these, podcasts are a great avenue to just have an open conversation, allow people to address questions that are, burning in their mind about what's going on in the signage space. And also it gives you a familiar face and people to look out for, in LinkedIn and all of the other people, pushing forward these projects. So I agree. I think there's really something unique just about this format of connecting with people.
There's definitely a progression of the way consumers like to kind of digest content as well. There's this now kind of prolific, reels and shorts and whatever it might be. And we just don't consume content the same way we did even 5-10 years ago. Blog
Mhm.
posts were, an SEO driver, and they always will be an SEO driver to some extent, I think. But this is a much more human way of connecting people with, where you can get key information out at a much more rapid pace that we can ingest whilst we're doing something else, like driving or whatever it might be, just to keep that flow of information, because people are just hungrier for it now.
It makes total sense. And, one of the things that I guess could be challenging when you're coming up with a podcast is, who to invite and what to talk about. obviously we're in a unique situation. So, how do you typically choose, the topics and guests for your show?
What I'm looking for is originality, just something that hasn't been discussed before. But it's always kind of front of mind is what kind of questions am I asking myself? And therefore, what could, someone who's a reseller be asking? A lot of the people that I know in industry, they're trying to keep at the forefront of quite a quick moving technology. And some things come up that just go under the radar. So it's trying to give more light to those things. And I think moreover, looking at what use cases are out there that are top of mind. So when we're looking at retail, what are retail environments really struggling with at the moment? And I think that's often things like, reduced square footage and requirements for increased turnover whilst having a smaller footprint and having, less staff. So it's all about kind of putting yourself in the mind frame of what questions might others be asking that you can fill that void with.
And that's interesting. It sounds like, obviously there's a lot of recurring themes and similar challenges that come up in the guests that you have. Is that, true? Are you seeing a lot of, similarity and maybe overlap in some of the challenges? They're just not, openly being discussed. So everybody thinks their own challenge is unique when really this conversations and community would sort of help bridge the gap there.
Yeah, to a large extent, I think there's a lot of similarities in industry. There's a lot of things that overlap just in general from both a hardware and a software perspective. There are similarities. I think it's more around the lines of how do we best communicate what the differentiators are and where the key struggles have been. I've had an episode a little while ago where everything kind of came full circle, where I could pick apart four different people's conversations from four different episodes, and they all made perfect sense of the conversation I was having. So there's different parts of the tool set that need to come out at certain times, and it's not for every instance. Like it's not for every retailer, for every QSR, or for education. But there are definitely some trends that people start picking up on, and I think that's really just customer driven. What people are what those customers are asking for in their technology tool belt.
Great. Well, it sounds like there were some, key moments that stood out to you in these conversations. Maybe you can tell us about, one or two key moments that really stand out to you and made a lasting impact or were quite memorable.
Yeah, for sure. One of my to be honest with you, one of my less successful podcasts I did in terms of numbers was I interviewed a guy who built his own CMS from scratch and implemented it into a basketball stadium in Germany. And I just found as an interview that for something to interview that's so fascinating because it's something that we talk about from a CMS perspective all the time. Of someone comes and says, "Well, we're looking at you, or we might look at building our own, etc., etc." And to actually speak to someone who went ahead and did that, typically that ends up being a bit of an empty threat because they realize the amount of body of work there is to do that, and what they
Mhm.
need as a resource to keep that not only built but then up to speed and with security patches and all this kind of stuff. So to actually sit down with someone who successfully implemented something like that was really, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that is one heck of an undertaking, building a
Hmm.
CMS from scratch when there's so many available tools out there. That's certainly a unique use case. And obviously, based on your work at Signage Live and your podcast, you're seeing a lot of evolution. Not just people wanting to abandon traditional methods of sourcing a product out there and building from scratch, but there's evolution in scheduling and the types of contents that's being distributed out there. So how have you seen the industry, evolve from both your work on the podcast and your work at Signage Live?
I think one of the key factors that is making a big difference now is, and it's dry and it's boring, but it's API documentation. And the reason for that is because as more and more SaaS softwares have become prevalent and more SaaS software technology is being utilized, there's an expectation from an end user perspective that when they purchase something, that it's going to integrate well with other tools that they have, or there'll be, other features. And digital signage is often packaged with other upgrades that are happening into a stadium or wherever it might be. It's very rare that it's the only thing going on. Typically, there's a big overhaul, or they're looking at improving their communications, and digital signage is part of that avenue.
Mhm.
So to have, the trends now is, can I integrate with, a something like a Meld CX or something where you've got AI vision analytics, or can I integrate later on and pull Zapier information or data or tool sets? There's a ton of things that you can now do to make communications more automated. Secure dashboards, being able to pull your Power BI or your SharePoint information straight from the source where the work's already been done for that data to be there. why not then go and communicate that securely out to your screens? So all of it is just about having the fundamentals right. So when someone comes and knocks on doors and say, "Hey, we want to go and integrate with XYZ," the answer is yes. It's not kind of a scramble to find a secondary version of that solution that can work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what makes, the work that you do at Signage Live so unique is, the interconnectivity of your platform and the tools that it could plug into. I've, seen a lot of customer opportunities where, they've developed a lot of these solutions from scratch in-house and
Mm,
tried to sort of back them into an existing solution and then ultimately ended up falling flat on their faces because it just was not well documented. It was not done in a procedural way that could be scaled in the future. So it's nice to hear that, there are tools out there and, the folks like yourself can really help drive that. And obviously, you've addressed this question before because, it's become, I think, increasingly more relevant in our lives is, the impact that AI has on the world and in general digital signage.
mm.
So are you starting to see that impact on your end?
To some extent, I think the AI conversation is interesting because it's one of the questions that I always ask because everybody's got an opinion, and I do feel like we're still quite early on in its tenure to make it the default. I think there are some tools that are really focusing on AI and using it well. I think there are others that are using AI kind of from a fad perspective. It's got to have some meaningful impact. I actually think that the AI is going to be most useful when it comes to things like being able to create content, advise you on scheduling, look at, especially when you start to pull in things like vision analytics, be able to look at the impact of the content you're delivering and then improve upon that in in a way that is more akin to when you go onto YouTube and you're recommended a range of videos because they know more about you in a
Mhm.
in an anonymous way, based on footfall traffic, based on time of day, based on gender, age, whatever that differentiator might be. I think AI is going to be most impactful in those spaces.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm not sure if you had a chance to try this out yet, but have you played with, Google's Notebook LLM?
A little bit, yeah, yeah. It's a really fascinating tool just to be open and available. I haven't found enough of a use case to go and delve into it fully, but I've had a couple of people share some LLMs with me, and I do think there's a huge use to that in the future.
What, I think totally freaked me out was the ability for it to generate an entire, very listenable podcast based on a
Hmm.
database of information. It's like, as I'm kicking off this podcast journey and having you here with me, I'm almost a little bit scared, are we irrelevant at this point? And is that what, information sharing might look like in the future?
I well, I hope not, to be honest with you. Because I think there's a universal experience that gets lost in that. Because then everybody has their own input and their own version of a podcast or their own conversation. And to be honest with you, it's not the best place. It's not the best place for original thought. It's a lot of kind of regurgitated thought. Now, if that is taken from the back of someone doing a 60-page document, which is their original thought, then you kind of get into a gray area of, well, it's just converting one medium into another medium that people prefer to ingest. I can totally see the value to that. I think there's always got to be a kernel of humanity underneath that to make it worthy of having that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as technology grows and continues to take over our life, especially with, AI, there is that human aspect that I think is lacking. And I think it's important that we continue to do the work that we're doing in, communicating human to the rest of, the community in pro AV and digital signage. And, what has podcasting taught you about the pro AV industry or about yourself?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it's just reinstated some facts that you hear but you don't see, which is that there are very incredible people that sit within the industry that have so much knowledge, and especially because this industry has a lot of diversity when it comes to where people's focuses are. And when you can find someone that really gets it, there's a couple of people in mind that I've had on the show that they're passionate about what they know and they know it into the nth degree. They can really pull apart a technology from its firmware, software, hardware, functionality, and almost create things out of that wasn't the intention of the product in the first place. So I do think it's been It's been interesting to speak to people in the industry. And I don't think that without the podcast, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to speak to those people. It's that our paths wouldn't have crossed.
Mhm.
So it's definitely given me that freedom to go and, just ask the question and learn from them. And then hopefully give some of that information to other people.
I mean, I don't know if I could have kicked this off without, having conversation with you. So I'm internally grateful for your exploration and deep dive into digital signage explored. Obviously, we've chatted before kicking off this journey, but for anybody else who's, considering to start their own, pro AV focused podcast or digital signage related podcast, what's a piece of advice you might give them?
I mean, if anyone's looking for a podcast, I would say test, and I would say find your uniqueness to what you're trying to say. Because I don't think you can't just turn the microphone on and go on. I'd also say just don't be afraid of trying it. Worst case scenario, you record it, you share it with some internal people that you trust, and they go, I don't think this is working. We need to tweak it. We need to look at it. That's the process you need to go through. And then commitment. Honestly,
Mhm.
when we started, we were fortunate because we had a good following on LinkedIn. And when we started, we had a kind of influx, but then the world dries up pretty quickly once you've spoken to the original, whatever following it is. And we saw
Mhm.
that drop down, but you keep consistent, you keep going, you keep trying to change the format or fix or experiment. And I've been very happy with the growth of the podcast and also the individuals that decide to follow along the journey. They're the people that I think can take the most value from this and that I can show internally and say that there is value to this. We're talking to the right people, they're engaging with us, and it's never you cannot start a podcast to make it a sales tool. It's not to talk about how good your product is or whatever. There might be certain instances where it comes up, but it has to be about engagement first and about, in a way, entertaining or educating an individual. You can do one or the other, or ideally, if you can do both, then that's great.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think, these shows are really all about community and, sharing and educating. So, if there's one key takeaway you hope your listeners gain from, your work at Signage Live or your podcast, what's that one key takeaway you hope, people that sticks with people?
I guess it's to show that there is there's something more behind the branding. There are individuals behind every company, not necessarily just Signage Live, but it is everything, at least right now, is run by humans for humans. It might change in the future, who knows? But there is more to a company or a brand than just this is product XYZ. There are people behind it. They're talented, they're effective at what they do, they're passionate about what they're trying to display, and they really do put their all into it. And I think being able to put those people in the forefront of that might not typically get that kind of opportunity, that's what I want people to come away with.
Great. And, real quick before we go, Tim, are there any exciting developments on the horizon for Digital Signage Explored that you want to share with the community?
Well, we just converted to a live format, which was a little bit dubious to do to begin with because there's an added level of stress to try and get someone onto the show when they know it's going to be live. There's always the power of magic of editing afterwards, but I really really like the live format because it's just that next stage of evolution.
Mhm.
From a content windowing perspective, which is a term we use when we're trying to utilize an asset as much as possible, making it live first makes sense because it gives people the opportunity to connect and interact rather than leaving comments. It's kind of a live exchange. That's gone pretty well so far. I think we've had good engagement with the right people where the value is there. Going into the future, I don't know. I think there's some discussions. Nothing's really set on the table at the moment. We're still kind of settling in. Obviously, ISE is coming up, so there's going to be some downtime, but there might be some original content coming out of ISE that'll be interesting for those that can't make it.
Awesome. Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing what's on the horizon for you. Where can people find you, Tim?
Hey, you can find me, Tim Baker on LinkedIn. So you can come and find me there. You can follow us, Digital Signage Explored, on the Signage Live LinkedIn page. You can obviously also find Signage Live at signagelive.com. And if you do want to follow us along there, we're just trying to build a community of individuals that want to learn about digital signage and hear other parts of that story.
That's great. Tim, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today. That concludes our episode today of Pixel Chatter. We look forward to having you back with us soon. Got some exciting things to come. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Justin.